So this is a talk about ideas as agents, the economics of collective intelligence, where I'll talk about how ideas can operate as agents in an economy. So we're going to be combining a bunch of different ideas, like I said, painting with a very broad brush over a bunch of different things. So I take ideas from economics, of course, that's my background, heavily influenced by the theory of constructed emotion created by Lisa Feldman Barrett, as well as Esther Thalen's work on the dynamic assembly of behavior, cognition, and form. We'll also be pulling from Paul Cusack's affordance competition hypothesis. There's also Mike Levin's morphogenesis and collective intelligence work I'm sure you're all familiar with. And then there's also the important work on moral psychology of relationship regulation theory by Tage Ryan, Alan Fisk. So this is what we'll all be combining as expediently as we can in this talk. So how does collective intelligence work? You have a system of many parts that have different goals and compete over scarce resources. So all these different parts, although they don't naturally work together, they're united by something that Mike Levin calls a cognitive glue, which is a policy that gets them all to coordinate and ultimately scale up their goals and competencies, allowing the total organism or economy or whatever collective intelligence you want to consider to do things that none of the individual parts can do on their own. So the famous example of cognitive glue is bioelectricity. Mike's been able to show how it has these incredible coordinative powers and is able to scale up a bunch of cells into a greater organism. My view of this is that cognitive glues are mediums for something I call interoception sharing. We'll explain in a little more detail what interoceptive signals are, but basically think of them as your thoughts, feelings, and all of the internal prediction signals going on inside of you. So if we're able to share all of these signals with each other, then we're going to end up fusing into each other because we're kind of sharing the parts of ourselves that make us our minds. So the economics of collective intelligence, I have a preprint out with Mike. It's through peer review, should be published some point in the future. The economics of this process is fairly well understood, actually extremely well understood. It literally goes back to Adam Smith. Basically, economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources, and the allocation of scarce resources depends heavily on a cognitive glue. So the price system is a cognitive glue, and in a sense that I'll discuss shortly, the cognitive glue, all cognitive glues are going to work like the price system because the price system is the right way for a cognitive glue to work. So the way I think of this, my hypothesis is that all collective intelligences are economies bound together by price-like systems, such as the actual price system, or bioelectricity, which I argue in my preprint with Mike is a price-like system. So for example, multicellular organisms are economies of cells bound together by bioelectricity, which means that all the different cells just work to basically take care of their own self-interest, but through the cognitive glue of bioelectricity, when they each pursue their own goals, they're bound together in such a way that they end up enhancing what everyone else is trying to do and scaling up a much more incredible system. So a really simple picture of how prices share interoceptive signals, how they do interoception sharing, which is what I think cognitive glue is all about. Let's say we've got a hungry guy over here, and that's red in his stomach is him being hungry. What he's going to do when he's hungry is he's going to bid up the price for bread. So the price of bread is going to go up. So he's able to take his hunger, his stress, and transmute that into an effect on the price system. And when the price goes up, what's going to happen is all these other people who maybe wanted to buy some bread, they're going to see that price is up, and so they're going to become more stressed out as well because they were hoping to buy bread, and now bread's really expensive. So through the price system, this guy's stress gets shared with everyone else. So stress sharing is an important example of a cognitive glue, and this is exactly how the price system does it. We're all able to share our stresses with each other, so we're not all alone dealing with our own problems. This guy's problem is now a collective problem. It's affecting everyone. And what happens when we create this kind of collective problem is we get collective problem solving, where because these guys are all stressed out, they respond to that stress by saying, I want to eat less bread. What does that do? Well, it makes bread more available. So we had our hungry guy who needed some bread. By sharing his stress with everyone else through the price system, he gets everyone else to behave in a way where they make bread more available to the hungry guy. So they're behaving as if we're all everyone's problem belongs to everyone now, and we all behave in ways that solve everyone's problem. So this is the really simple Econ 101 view of how prices are a cognitive glue that make us a collective intelligence. And the reason why the price system is the way of thinking about cognitive glues is that prices are the uniquely efficient way of doing this. So the simplest way, I think, to see the unique efficiency of prices is to consider their bow tie architecture. So a price, let's say you have the price of an apple, let's say it's $1. Well, there's a vast number of different histories as sort of depicted, like a huge cone of possible histories, can all be fed into the same single price. There's a million different reasons an apple could cost $1. And then with that price, you can use that to form all kinds of different plans and futures. And so you have a tremendous amount of history, you have a tremendous amount of possible futures, and yet all of it can sort of be condensed into a single price. So that's obviously incredibly efficient to take all that information and shrink it down into one number. That's hard to beat. So prices are a uniquely efficient way of achieving this kind of coordination. So how does this, so this is some stuff. So I know there was a lot of talk about language and kind of auto-generative stuff. So we see the same situation with prices. So first of all, prices are relationally real. This is something Lisa Feldman Barrett talks about a lot, called relational realism. So prices are meaningless in isolation. If I tell you an apple costs $1, it doesn't really tell you anything about what's going on with that apple. But if you know that oranges cost $2, now there's meaning in relation, where you know that if you buy an apple, you're giving up half an orange. Or if you buy an orange, you're giving up 2 apples. So any one price in isolation doesn't really help you. But if you know 2 or more prices, then the relational meaning allows you to form all kinds of plans. Prices also have this auto-generative property, where as you add and remove prices, like let's say we've got some apples and some oranges and stuff, and then someone introduces the grapple, which is like a sort of grape flavored apple, and that has a certain price. Well, all the prices will automatically and sort of effortlessly adjust their meaning to the new price. So this allows the economy to freely add and remove goods and services for sale to the economy, and to continually update the prices, because the prices will just assemble new meanings on their own in relationship to each other. So getting into now the concept of ideas as agents, I really pull from this interoception and allostasis theory that comes from Lisa Feldman Barrett. Her theory of constructed emotion says that all behavioral and psychological processes are due to interoception and allostasis. So the theory of constructed emotion, it started as a study of emotion, but despite the name, it's now a general theory of all behavioral and psychological processes. So allostasis is the allocation of scarce resources within the brain and body. So the allocation of things like blood, glucose, oxygen, water, all the things that all the different parts of your body need to do what they want to do. Allostasis is the process of managing that allocation. As any economist can tell you, the economy is, the definition of economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources. So allostasis is an economic process within the brain and body. And what interoceptive signals are, they're internal prediction signals that participate in the process of allostasis. They do so by competing and coordinating with each other as patterns and ensembles within the body that in the aggregate construct the things we experience as our perceptions, cognitions, and actions. So interoceptive signals are also relationally real and auto-generative. So Lisa will tell you all about how interoceptive signals are meaningless in isolation, but by seeing how they vary with each other and relate to each other, they end up acquiring meaning over time. They're also auto-generative, which is this thing she calls ad hoc concepts, where whenever you encounter a new situation, you're not pulling on some kind of stored memory for how to behave in that situation. Instead, the interoceptive signals assemble in a new way based on their historical experiences, but they just figure out in the moment what the optimal thing to do is. And so she calls that an ad hoc concept, and that allows you to deal with new situations. And the reason interoception sharing, why I think it's what cognitive glue is all about, if you think about interoceptive signals as everything that generates your thoughts and behaviors, then if we share those signals with each other, then now we're constructing behaviors and psychological processes together, because that's what interoceptive signals do. So if we share them, then now we're doing those things together instead of in isolation. So as a sort of general theoretical perspective on the agencies of these ideas, we can consider ideas for motor plans. So this is a generalization of Paul Chisek's affordance competition hypothesis. I call it the rational internal competition and selection hypothesis. Say you've got a lion and you're chasing some zebras, you're trying to get some food, and there's 2 zebras, you're chasing after them. and you're not really sure yet which one is going to be the better one to pounce on, because maybe right now they're running pretty equally, but at one point, like, one's going to veer off or one's going to stumble, and you want to be ready for that moment. But you don't know which zebra that's going to be. So rather than waiting for that moment to happen and then forming a motor plan for that, you need to be able to react quickly. So what Paul says you do is you have multiple motor plans inside of you, one to go after the one zebra, the other to go after the other. And both of these motor plans are patterns of signals that compete inside of you to basically happen and to inhibit the other one. And what ultimately will happen is you'll use sensory data to bias the selection process to who wins the competition. So like if you see one zebra win or one zebra stumble, that's like powerful evidence that allows one motor plan to defeat the other in the competition and go attack that zebra. So what's really interesting about this, if you're trying to figure out how does one motor plan outcompete the other, the brain is not just picking, okay, I like this motor plan better, that's what we're doing. It's this internal economic process of allostasis, the competition between the motor plans over available resources to control the body and move toward that zebra that decides that wins. And as any economist can tell you, processes of economics such as allostasis are ultimately determined by the behaviors of the individual agents in the system, which in this case, those agents must be the interoceptive signals, which we could also, in coordination with each other, call the ideas. So for this kind of story to make sense, and I think there's very good evidence for it, it is necessarily the case that we need to think of signals inside of you as economic agents. There's no other way to make sense of that. So that's the basic theoretical picture of why I think it makes sense to talk about ideas as economic agents and what that kind of story would look like. I'll go very quickly over two empirical examples that I think are very compelling. The first one is the A not B error. So this is a classic child psychology experiment. Setup is you have a kid with a little toy and two opaque boxes, box A and box B. You hide the teddy bear in box A. There's no tricks here, so the box is opaque, but you show the kid, hey, I'm taking the toy, I'm putting it in the box. The kid can see what you're doing. And so what does the kid do when you do that? Well, the kid wants his toy, so he goes and searches under box A. Then what you do is you repeat this. He gets his toy. Now he's happy. Then you take the toy and you hide it in box B this time. And again, there's no tricks. The kid sees exactly what you're doing. So you'd think he must search under box B because that's where he sees the toy. But actually what he does is he searches for box A again, as if he thinks the toy is there. So it's called the A not B error because he searches under box A, not box B. So the question is, why does this happen? The sort of classical interpretations of it is that it's something to do with memory or inhibition issues that children may have. You may have also heard of object permanence. This is a hypothesis to try to explain this experiment. All of these hypotheses have been falsified by experiment. So just as a simple example, younger infants can actually do better than older infants. So like 2 to 5 month old infants do better than 7 to 8 month old infants. So if you think it's a memory issue, that doesn't really make sense. The developmental psychologist Esther Thalin and her collaborators did a series of experiments testing all the conditions under which this error occurs. And to make a long story short, what's going on is that the pattern of signals inside the infant that construct their behaviors, those form memories about what kind of behaviors that they like to construct, which are those ad hoc concepts that I discussed. And those, the ultimate pattern that wins out isn't just something that the brain decides. It's influenced by many factors. And so what I take from this is that the internal signals inside the brain and body have a life of their own that is not reducible to the brain's knowledge and goals. So people have historically tried to explain this kind of phenomenon by being like, well, what is the brain thinking? Why would the brain do this? And the answer is, it's not the brain thinking this, it's the ideas themselves inside of you, the patterns of signals that end up determining what happens. And they're even able to reproduce in a limited degree this kind of behavior in adults, because adults are better at, kind of getting the ideas to work certain ways. Those ideas always have a life of their own. And one final empirical example comes from moral psychology. So the standard view of moral psychology is that morality is built by evolution into the brain for the purpose of long-term social cooperation, aiding survival and reproduction. This idea is very popular. It does very badly on the evidence. So a better view that's emerging in the 2020s is that morality develops in the same way that morphogenesis and infant skills develop. Just basically the interoceptive signals get better and better at assembling various patterns through the process of allostasis and for achieving allostatic outcomes. Relatedly, there's this idea of relationship regulation theory from Tage Rye and Alan Fisk, which says that morality is not about long-term cooperation. It is not about survival and reproduction. It's about something they call relationship regulation. So managing the relationships you have with the people around you in your society. Sometimes that can aid survival and reproduction, like maintaining a relationship with a spouse or something, but can also be very harmful to those things, like maybe you get into a bar fight with someone at a bar because you're trying to assert a certain kind of relationship that you're not going to back down or something. That can get you into a fight, that can get you hurt, that can get you into trouble. So morality doesn't seem to be something that's just built into the brain. It doesn't seem to be necessarily controlled to what we might think of as traditional biological outcomes. Instead, I think the best hypothesis is that morality has a life of its own ideas and goals that it's trying to achieve. And there's a struggle between morality and other goals. And, it's a constant economic competition. So in summary, interoceptive signals, which we could think of as ideas, or at least collections and patterns of them are ideas, they are economic agents that participate in and are made meaningful by the economic process of allostasis. Allostasis is responsible for producing all behavioral and psychological processes. This is a very general theory that should apply across humans, organisms, other economic systems. Those interoceptive signals have goals and memories of their own, such as assembling a particular class of motor behaviors or of regulating relationships in a way that can't be reduced to anything stored in the brain or encoded in the genome. So that is my talk. I know that was a lot very quickly, but basically the TLDRs, I do think there's very good evidence from economics and psychology to say that ideas really do have a life of their own ideas, their own goals, they are agents. And so that's kind of where I am on that. So thank you very much for listening to that. I know that was a lot, but happy to open it up now for discussion.
So Dr. Hahn, any thoughts as it connects to the idea of autogeneration, hyperorganisms like you always talk about? Any parallels there?
Oh, absolutely. Hundreds. First, Benjamin, fantastic discussion. Really excited about what you're working on. These are some thoughts that I've been thinking, but this is kind of a different framework and a different approach. So for me, it's really refreshing. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
As you know, my background's in complex systems, and economics was one of the first areas that kind of emerged where people realized we needed not just a new way of thinking about science or understanding the world, but the thing I really like about complex systems is purposely taking ideas and insights from one field and like bringing them, just dragging them, kicking and screaming to a completely different area. And so I think these ideas of like thinking of the brain as an economy and vice versa that's super fascinating for me.
Awesome. Yeah. And well, like economics has always had, I think, some ability to do this. Like, Friedrich Hayek's The Use of Knowledge in Society was very influential in cybernetics. And so I do think, I actually have a recent essay about this, economic reductionism, I think it's called, basically arguing that you can think of basically any complex system or simple system for that matter as an economy, that economics might be a useful bridging science. How can biologists talk to mathematicians, talk to physicists, talk to, psychologists? Maybe economics can be a common, lingua franca there that can help people share ideas.
Absolutely. Because I think traditionally we thought of it as this, kind of the simple version of it. Okay, there's human markets and there's money and there's goods and trades and all that. But to see it as an abstract information processing kind of paradigm, that it's something almost even more general maybe than computation, because you're talking about resources itself. And computation is kind of the study of how we use different resources, whether it's you have extra time or you have extra space, how can you get certain problems done? And it seems, especially a lot what you're saying is economics is the study of, well, how do we move those resources around to begin with, right? Because we can't do any kind of computation or pattern matching if we don't have some sort of abstract power supply or whatever that might be, or the ability to kind of move data, which we're now seeing this economy where people realize data is the new oil and data is the new gold. And so you're shipping patterns around, but now there's this sort of new economic layer. on top of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's there's yeah, so economics has historically been very ready to just basically leave certain things up to the competencies of the parts, like the computational processes by which a human might make a decision. Economics has mostly been willing to just say people can just figure that out. Like some people have tried to study neuroeconomics and stuff, but for the most part, we're like, the parts of the system can figure that out, but we're interested in how those different parts of the system compete and coordinate with each other to determine the allocation of scarce resources. But then what they actually do with those resources, a little bit more of a black box where they're able to just turn their resources into the outcomes they want. And historically, economics has not been too concerned about how that process works because we're more interested in the allocation process that precedes it.
Right. It's sort of an abstract level up. It reminds me from physics, the idea of coarse graining, that you sort of don't worry about the details below a certain resolution and just kind of model it that way.
I can hear Daniel Dan talking about coarse graining in my head right now.
It also reminds me of some work I did a while back in sparse coding with sort of this block coding where you just sort of make a fake resource in terms of like updating the weights. And so you can imagine like the blood allocation in an actual neuronal system, and then in like a neural network training simulation, like the so-called gradient descent where you're updating the weights and so on. You can do that in kind of a block paradigm where you only let certain regions of the weights update at any given loop, essentially. And just by having that constraint, you get organization at a whole different scale. And so some of the stuff that you were saying sort of reminds me of that, in that we can communicate. Michael Levin talks about these stressors, and you were talking about the prices. And to me, it seems like that's the same thing that you're getting at, that signal actually has tremendous utility.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Once you can get things to coordinate, they start exhibiting all these crazy new competencies. I mean, just like the division of labor. So all these ideas are really very old in economics, and it's been very interesting to watch them be rediscovered in aspects of biology and psychology. But I mean, yeah, just like the ability for us to like do economics or do complex system studies or anything like that, like an individual human caveman is never going to be interested in any of that. They're never even going to think about that. When you get us all working together in the economy, suddenly we find out we're interested in all these things. Like obviously we did not evolve to study science, right? We didn't evolve for that. There was not a lot of selection pressure there, but yet suddenly we have these abilities when you get us interacting through the price system. It's pretty crazy stuff.
I want to add one thing before we open up more to the audience of people, because this is kind of an open discussion. Just sort of going off of one of the things we were talking about yesterday at the previous salon, about sort of the lens that we're using to interpret and coordinate information. And what I'm wondering, and if you've thought of this, is there a reason that it was easier, or it seems like it was easier for us to attribute this label of economics to these human scale systems and not to like cellular systems? Like, why was it sort of easier for us to put this name of economics and create this pricing framework around human societies and all those kinds of things, and not at the cellular, chemical, physics level kind of things? Because I think it kind of goes all the way down, but what is it about that scale specifically of organization and coordination that it makes it easier to draw that kind of framework?
So economics requires agents. The parts of the system have to be agents for economics to make sense. That's a very powerful thing because that allows me to argue that ideas are agents because I can see them participating in an economy and therefore they must be agents. But what that requires then is a willingness to call things agents. So for multicellular organisms to be economies, you have to say that the cells are agents, for example. Now, I think it's obvious that cells are agents because if you look at like videos of them, you can see them looking for food and trying to make decisions. So I don't know why this is controversial, but it is very controversial. A lot of people really don't like the idea that there's all these different kinds of agents out there. They think that agency needs to be limited to humans and things that are very, very, very similar to humans. I have an essay on my website. It's called Agency is Basic and Simple in Economics, where I basically show that agency is actually a very minimal assumption that we should expect to apply to basically anything, but it's not what people currently are inclined to believe. And so that makes it difficult for them to see economic structure in places where it can definitely be found.
That's interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, go ahead, Will.
No, go ahead.
No, it's fine. You take the mic.
No, I just think it's a great example of something we've been discussing, that you need this new vocabulary to understand kind of the actual phenomena that's out there in the world. We need to be willing to borrow. So you were saying that you were surprised that people don't think of cells as agents, but I see those as sort of really different kind of academic intellectual traditions that have only recently kind of started to come together. And when I think of the future of science, the stuff is already here. I remember this was, gosh, almost 15 years ago with Elon, about 14 years ago, talking about AI, and I said everything's here. It's already, all the pieces are already on the floor. We just have to pick them up and put it together. And I think that turned out to be the case. We didn't really need anything exotic to make AI. It's actually relatively conventional. It's a scale that we didn't expect. We need more GPUs than we thought, but it's kind of the same roadmap that we've had on the books for 75 years or so. But I think bringing the new words, these ideas from economics, to have this kind of crosstalk is where we're going to make that progress. Like, in other words, like the ideas of agents and economies and cells, they're already all there, but they're spread out in the library, and they're spread out amongst the human minds because of the way we do training. And I think that's where all the low hanging fruit is going to be, is just kind of that crosstalk.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's always been there, and people are just starting to figure that out, it seems like. So, like, Mike has a blog post today talk about anthrobots and how they've got all these weird agential properties where you just can't explain it in terms of like evolution and the genes and stuff, because none of that's really happened or has changed, but you're seeing all this new stuff. So people are coming around to that. It's probably the sort of thing where science proceeds by funerals, but like in a generation or two, it might actually just be a common assumption. I even have a talk that I gave to his lab about math being like an agent. So like truly at the most bottom of bottoms, you have agency there. So I think you're right that, yeah, it was always here, and it's just about kind of getting enough of it together and sufficiently coordinated together that you start to see the kinds of things that we would want to call, like AGI or whatever.
Right.
I was gonna say, like, I'm always thinking about, okay, it's easy to sort of find something when you know what to look for, but how do you find something when you don't know what to look for, right? And like, yeah, like if I'm really focusing, say, on the color blue, it's a little easier for me to look around and for it to kind of stand out, because I'm trying to think about finding it. But how do you find and think about something that you don't necessarily have a framework or a concept for? All right. So Benjamin, I don't know if I mentioned this the other day about this big thought experiment, and I want to hear how you would kind of interpret this. So, let's just say you have sticks and stones, right? If you've never seen fire or smoke before, how do you have any idea of how to coordinate those particles and those things to create this thing called smoke or fire? Because you can do it, but what's sort of that kind of bottleneck, if at all, that doesn't allow you to perceptually experience those sticks and stones as tools of creating fire, right? Because it's a use case of it. You can definitely do it, but why is it that you can't? How is it that you, from your economic standpoint of these things, right? Let's think of perceptual economics. What is the sort of gating mechanism that's, again, from an economics perspective, what is the gating mechanism that doesn't allow this concept to enter in when you look at that, or what would allow it to enter in? Maybe
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And of course, I don't know precisely how people would ever figure that out. But where I'm inclined to go with that is to suggest that ad hoc concepts lead to ad hoc concepts. So ad hoc concepts, we could also think of them as, self-improvising memories, I think is a question Mike Levin has used. You can maybe think of them as being auto-generative, just like language and prices are, where each concept is going to help to generate new concepts. And basically, as you do one kind of thing, that's going to help lead to new ideas that you wouldn't have predicted before doing that first thing. Having done that first thing, now other things are occurring, and maybe eventually you somehow iterate. So just as like a very simple example, like on my blog, I have a bunch of essays. I didn't start out with ideas for all those essays, but like each essay I write gives ideas about new essays. And it's not like it's exactly a new idea. It's like a transformation of an old idea. But I wouldn't have been able to come up with that next transformation without the earlier one. And so I think by somehow ad hoc concepts eating other ad hoc concepts and generating themselves like that is maybe how you do it.
And also, it sounds a lot like computational irreducibility, that path that you took actually matters.
Yeah, historical processes are such a big deal. So there's a lot of this that goes on with like Esther Thalen's work, who I always like to emphasize both the development of infants, from a baby to an adult, and also the development of any individual motor behavior you do, whether as an individual or as an adult. There's an actual historical process that the developmental process goes through that absolutely matters for determining what happens.
Fascinating.
I'm
I
curious
love the
if
idea.
our Wolfram Institute member has anything to mention on the computational irreducibility. Mr. Hammock.
So, I mean, no, it's interesting because, like, negotiating price is something which is like you have to go through the computation of it. You can't just jump to the end.
Yeah, and that's why bow ties are such a big deal, that bow tie architecture. But you can take in all these different histories and still just get that into just one single price. Like if you think about, I think actually, William, I think you have an essay about this, like everything that goes into creating wheat, like all the incredibly complex processes and all the different ways you could go through. There's so many different historical processes you could go through to create a piece of wheat. And yet all that can just be, summarized into a single price that can then be easily used by anyone who doesn't even know anything about the history of wheat to make whatever, consumption decisions they want.
Yeah, there's so much that factors into that, like, farming equipment prices. If those go up, then that's going to have an effect. But it might like down the line or something. But
there's a classic essay called I Pencil, where a guy goes through the absurdly complicated process of making something as simple as a pencil. And at the end of the day, even though it's insanely complex, pencil, it's like, I don't know, 50 cents for like 10 of them. If you break one, you don't even care. So like, it's so incredibly complicated and amazing. But at the end of the day, it's also so reliable that the resulting objects are like barely even valuable to us.
It's super interesting because I think we tend to think that with something like a pencil, that it's too complex for an individual or a small group. The example I like to give is like a turkey sandwich is so unbelievably complicated that if you tried to like imagine all the processes that took to make it happen, you would kind of go nutty. And I'd always tend to think of that as kind of a personal limitation of my brain power. But what you're saying makes me think that it's really the universe can't keep track of all that. That we have to collapse the turkey sandwich down to like a price and it's $3.99 or whatever, because there's not enough space in the world. It's not just our brain power. Where would we keep track of all of the things and the complexity that went into creating that?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think what's one of the things that's great about bringing economics into these kinds of discussions is I think that economics does a really, like, we understand economics very well. We've been studying these issues since literally Adam Smith. So they're really old topics in economics, and we know a lot about how they work. They're also very abstract and clear in general. And so like what we can see with how the economy manages this stuff, I think you could think of the economy as a mind. It is a collective intelligence. And so in that sense, a mind is handling the production of a pencil. However, the way it does so isn't by storing a bunch of facts and then running some kind of computation over those facts. It's the process of allocation, the economic process of the allocation of scarce resources that simultaneously constructs that economic mind, and through that combined process ends up producing, pencils. So like the mind doesn't like think through it. It's the very process of the construction of the mind that also produces all the things that the mind does.
And I think we should suspect that the brain is actually doing something much more like that than we traditionally thought.
I think so. And that's exactly what I get from Lisa Feldman Barrett. So just like Mike discovered economic structure in morphogenesis and the construction of organisms, she discovered economic structure and how the brain works. What I think she would tell you is that the way it comes up with its thoughts and ideas is it's all about just allocating scarce resources within the brain and body. And the net result of that is things that we then label perception, action, cognition. What the brain is really thinking is like, okay, I got to get some glucose over here, some blood over there. And that's really more like what's going on.
So ideas are competing for compute, essentially. The resources in the brain, which like I said, glucose and blood. Would you say that ideas in the brain are fighting for our attention?
Yeah, I think attention is an extremely important resource, and that definitely makes sense. I will say that although it's intuitive to focus on the brain, and that's certainly what Lisa and her lab does, my perspective is that the brain is probably analogous to a financial system. So the financial system isn't exactly an executive like we might traditionally think of the brain as being. What the financial system does is it coordinates all the other parts of the economy. It helps them manage issues that occur over space and time when you're trying to coordinate. Like, how do you coordinate with like a facility in China that's producing goods for your industry? You need finance to help you do that. I think that's what the brain does. So yeah, attention is like, can we get, you need resources to basically help you even just like make contracts and form certain deals, and calling that attention, I think, makes a lot of sense. And so that is a very valuable thing.
And I mean, what's the role of emotions here in the brain? I mean, you have ideas, and then each sort of idea kind of has an emotion attached. Like, either you like the idea or you don't like the idea. Some ideas are like screaming at you, saying that they're really important, or they're, especially if there's sort of like a threat in the environment, you have like fear attached to like an idea. And so that'll like scream at you, and like you have to think about it. You have to put your attention on that idea and sort it out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as the name suggests, the theory of constructed emotion definitely started with a focus on emotion, and that's kind of by studying that is what brought Lisa to this bigger view. Yeah, affect, like Jesse is saying. At this point, actually, the theory of constructed emotion, though, really is not specifically about emotion in any way. And my understanding of it, what it does, is rather than telling us what emotion is, it actually kind of reduces emotion back to basically everything you do is just this process of interoception and allostasis. And then human observers then lump that into categories, say this is an emotion, this is a memory, this is an action, this is a perception. But these are all just ways of categorizing the outputs of interoception and allostasis. And what's also going on, and this is can be very challenging to navigate at times, but it's a third person theory of thought and behavior. So we feel emotions very powerfully, and they feel from a first person perspective like they're doing a lot. But what the third person theory says is it's all the same process, and there's nothing that's really specially distinguishing emotion or anything else. And as for why that sort of generic third person process creates all these special first person feelings, currently we have no idea, as far as I'm aware. That's basically a hard problem of consciousness type stuff, which I don't have any solution to. I don't believe Lisa does either.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump in really quickly on that, I think that's sort of the realm of phenomenology, and like I mentioned in the chat, Thomas Fuchs and some of his work on like the ecology of the brain and sort of this vertical horizontal causality type stuff. But one of his key things is like basal affectivity. And I think there's an interesting tie to the interoception allostasis discussion here. Like basal affectivity is sort of like just, even before it gets to like a cognitive level of elaborate, broader emotions, basal affectivity is sort of the like deep core precognitive, like yes or no, like are you closer to, do you want to be closer to or further away from this? So like the foundations of that experience. And I do agree that that is phenomenology and the subjective experience of that, and attempting to bring rigor to that. We've talked in some past salons a little bit about mentioning like cardio phenomenology, or there's other like neurophenomenology, which is like the Francisco Varela and his lineage about this take on all that stuff. But I think centering it on a functional third person economic view like this definitely has its merits, and particularly for explaining or the things that we're talking about here make a lot of sense in that context. And I do think it's a very I think there's a why. I'm all for like not being reductionistic or compartmentalizing and so on. But I think the differentiation here between deep understandings of the personal subjective phenomenological stuff and what we're talking about here is particularly valid. So I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it would be great to make progress on first person experiences. I mean, ultimately, whenever someone does so, presumably we'll uncover some amazing mystery of the universe, because right now that stuff is super mysterious, and hopefully that would lead to some very powerful things. One thing that I always think about, though, what's so challenging about this is our first person experiences are so different from our third person view of the world that not only like historically there were a lot of problems with trying to do first person emotion science. So like, when we feel our emotions, they feel like they just happen suddenly and like you can't really control them. Just like you've probably all heard of like system 1, system 2, like because that's what we feel is our first person. Is like sometimes things kind of just happen like automatically, like feels very animalistic. Sometimes you think about things and it's much more slow. Turns out there's no evidence for system 1 and system 2. It's not how the brain works. And so we definitely need a way of figuring out first person stuff. Apparently Mike may have some ideas for how to do that, but historically it's been a problem, right? Is like people have come up with very bad third person theories by trying to make sense of their first person experiences.
Yes, I would totally agree with that. In the sense of almost like the weird disengagement, like the empirical turn and the scientific revolution and all of this stuff has been really good for certain things, and then kind of discarding the subjective experience as, getting in the way of the science and finding the truth through the empirical science. Like there's a reason why that happened, and that's okay. But in place of taking all that seriously, there's been a lot of very strange, like like trait stuff and trying to box people's experience into really clunky things. And then that's a lot of like, you take that into the course of like how the DSM evolved and what is a normal person and where do these norms come from. And it gets, I think there's been a pretty a mismanagement of that space. So that's why I think I'm not averse to it. A lot of people say, "Oh, don't talk about emotions, go into emotions," because if you want to do well in like psychology or certain like cognitive science stuff, there's all these baggages about it. I think there's a way to do it, but I think it's right to kind of separate that from this right now. And even to kind of know what I was going to say before a little bit, I think this approach to economics and sort of economics almost as just systemic theory or a way to engage with this sort of relative complexity of this stuff is actually a nice bridge in the right direction towards maybe reclaiming some of that stuff one day or reinvestigating it in a better light. Like kind of like what Elon was saying, like a lot of the stuff is there. It's just the ideas and kind of unscrewing up certain things and silos and whatnot. But basically taking this economics point of view or this inherent, it's a way of recentering relationships, which I think is really fun. One of the most fun things between this talk and last talk is this way of really centering how relational these things are and using this sort of contemporary take on, agents is kind of a top word now for other things, but using the agency as a way to confer. It's a third person perspective on stuff, like as in not subjective, but there's the implied commentary on the relationship of an agent to the choices it's presented with and how those choices are dependent on the relationship of alternatives or opportunity costs. I think that's actually quite a useful way to kind of shift the overall discussion, the Overton window, if you will, in the spaces towards being a little more relationally focused overall. And I'm curious, I know we chime in a little bit, but I'm curious if you guys have any other thoughts on that part of it.
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things about that. I think the relational thing is super important. Lisa talks extensively about relational realism, so I strongly encourage anyone to just type into Google Lisa Feldman-Barrett relational realism. You'll see some really interesting things come up. Math is also highly relational, so just something simple as like, what is the number 3? Well, it's the number between 2 and 4. Like that's how it's defined. So math is highly relational. In like category theory, for example, there's the famous or perhaps someone infamous, depending on what context you're seeing it in, but the Ionato lemma, which basically says that you can characterize an object up to isomorphism just by considering its relationship. So you could know everything that's important to know about an object just by seeing how it relates to everything else. So yeah, I think relational realism is a very important idea that we see borne out both empirically and in mathematical structure itself.
Dr. Hahn, any thoughts?
Super interesting. Yeah, I've got so many notes here of things I'd want to bring up. I love the idea. We often joke that it's the thoughts doing the thinking. And you mentioned something like it's, the goals are alive, and it's the memories have memories. And I think that's super interesting on a few different levels, like the theoretical, but also kind of the practical side of behavior, mental health, that sort of thing. That when we think of like traumatic stress, that sort of survives in the brain for decades, somehow it's fighting for stability, that memory has some sort of evolutionary niche that is hard to kind of root out, and most people would rather sort of plant other organisms in that soil, so to speak. But I love that kind of idea, that it reminds me of the idea of like replicators in the brain, that ideas have kind of this Darwinian, or sometimes talk about Edelman process, will both kind of replicate and then find make copies of themselves in your mind. And it makes me think of this stability in terms of the economics. So one of the biggest things in our economy is real estate, and sort of mental real estate is probably going to be the same thing, that these ideas they're fighting for attention, but they're also just fighting for a place to live. Or at least some of them are. Maybe these, whether they're good, bad memories or bad memories, they are sort of finding their way in there sometimes for years, which is kind of their defining property
It's like
as a memory.
someone lives rent free in your mind.
Exactly, right? Literally. But it's not rent free, right? It's part of this economy, and they're getting subsidized rent or whatever from something. And also this idea that like feeding on behaviors, and that the currency would be kind of like neurotransmitters in a sense, and that certain ideas, if they can access certain feedback loops, then they will persist, they'll get reinforced. And so they're kind of fighting literally for those neurotransmitters in a sense.
Yeah. You could almost think of, instead of like reproduction in the traditional sense, normally you might expect an organism to like lay some eggs or split itself in half or do something that's sort of physically concrete like that.
Mm-hmm.
What the ideas could instead be doing is basically helping, like in the case of trauma, for example, like the ideas are just patterns of signals. They're not going to be permanent. They're going to die. They're going to do so without making babies in the traditional sense. But if they can help to reshape the internal structure of the brain so that idea is likely to re-emerge again, it's like, instead of reproducing, they reincarnate effectively.
Right.
And yeah, that could definitely be a very powerful lens on trauma and many other things as well.
I was
Super
actually
interesting.
That goes back to what I was saying about like emotion. Like you have this traumatic experience, and that memory has like imprinted with it like all this cortisol, all this stress, and that for some reason like prompts rumination on that same thing. Like you have post-traumatic stress on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's a big part of where that speed comes from. We feel an emotion happen so suddenly. Well, if the brain is really ripe conditions for those patterns to reemerge, then they will in fact reliably happen very quickly, even if the actual underlying process is much more complex than what we experience.
As far as reproducibility for ideas, I mean, this is, memes, right? Like, some ideas have a higher propensity to be transmitted, to be communicated, and to propagate throughout like a social network.
Yeah, that's a great comparison. I mean, that might be a very analogous idea.
Could you? I have two fronts that I'm thinking about this in. Yeah, two. So the first one is, I would say, I think one of the themes we're getting at here is I feel like the act of observation and perception in and of itself is a form of reproduction. I don't mean your eyes are making babies just now. I don't mean that. I mean, maybe very weirdly, abstractly. But what I'm saying is that when you take in information, the filtering, the economical decision process, right? The abstraction process of perception and measuring something, and bringing it into your scope of reality. You're not actually seeing everything, right? One of the things that people say when you're reproducing information is that you're either identically cloning it, and I could argue whether or not true cloning of something actually exists, but it's usually in accordance to a criteria, some filtering process, right? And the filtering process is a decision process. It's an economical process about what is and what may, what shouldn't be let into the space, into this distribution of things. And when you when you think of these ideas of thought forms or whatever, which Dr. Hahn and Dugan, we've all kind of spoken about this before, is that, there's one of these things that parents will tell their kids. They'll say, hey, don't get our negative properties, focus on our positive properties, right? If you're hanging around your friends, take the positive traits from them, not the negative ones. And if you sort of learn to experience the information in this specific way, you're filtering and selecting for that, like the selection process itself through iteration. And that's what you're kind of embodying and you're letting into the system, right? It's sort of like when we do as I say, not as I do, right? In a sense. But that's an interesting thing. And in a weird way, I think the act of reproducing in biology or all these kinds of things is it's a selection process. I really do think that the act of reproducing, whether it's the way humans do it or other organisms, whatever, it's a selection and filtering process. And that is also the iteration process. Right. So I'm curious from your kind of this complex systems economics perspective from Dr. Hahn and Benjamin Lyons, like, what do you think of the nature, the philosophical implications of reproduction itself, of iteration, of the filtering process? Because you're taking something and by observing it a certain way, you're only seeing certain aspects of it, right? Even when I look at, my hand or something, even if I form continuity around my whole hand and I can stitch the image together, I'm still not seeing all of it. Right, that's why in the visual medium, I can only recreate what I'm kind of visually seeing and experiencing and observing. It takes a whole different set of experiences to tap into what's happening, inside my skin, into the bones and the muscles and all that. And I don't have direct access to that in a sense. And so I'm curious if you've thought of the idea of perception, observation, measurement as a form of iteration and reproduction of information.
I do have some writing about this, and I've been trying to write more, and those essays have been taking a while. But basically, there is certainly, of course, something very important about filtering and selection. You could talk about like mathematical examples where you might do a function that like preserves some structure but not other structures. So you're seeing part of a larger system. Like you can map a group, which is a set with an operation on it, down into just the underlying set without the operation. So you remember the set, and like you're selecting or filtering for the set, but not for the operation itself. So that's a simple example of that. But what I've been thinking about in terms of perception especially is it's intuitive to think of perception as reproducing the environment. So the environment looks a certain way, and then we reproduce that with some kind of internal representation. But I think it's plausible that what's actually going on is that we are engaged in a creative process where our perceptions are things we create to basically manage that internal process of coordination and cooperation. So somehow perceptions end up being a sort of useful technology for the things inside of us to coordinate around. So just as like a very simple example of that. So like, what do things, take like vision, for example, like we might think that things look a certain way, and then like we see an aspect of that. And we understand we're not seeing, microscopic things, we're not seeing certain wavelengths, but like basically we think things look a certain way. And actually they don't. Like what does my hand look like without some kind of visual process? I mean, that question doesn't even make sense. So I think it's plausible that all of our perceptions are actually totally creative processes where all that's going on is just a process of internal coordination. And there may actually, depending on how literal you want to be about this, potentially be no reproduction, and all creation could be what's going on.
Yeah, it's very much a coarse graining, and you're just sort of pulling out some features of the environment and then making some qualia enough to do what your computation needs, like, to navigate the environment, let's say.
I think it's interesting to think about the kind of developmental and evolutionary history of that worldview, because I tend to agree with you that it's probably entirely virtualized, in that it doesn't actually correspond with sort of reality, but it's this shared organism. It kind of we're the substrate for that, and we replicate it and share it when we share perspectives through language or other experience. But it makes me think of like a dog doesn't worry about the stock market, right? They have like their own reality, and they created this kind of low dimensional world, and they're super happy to live in it. And I think that's kind of what most life forms do. They create this little kind of informational manifold, and they live there, and they don't have to worry about, it's not that you, not even that you don't have to worry about, you can't worry about the complexity of even a small piece of the world. And so we have to just create this thing that is manageable, and then we live there. Fish created their own coral reef, right? It's like the coral. You make your own reef, and then you live there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's what Mike calls a cognitive light cone. And there's actually very important connections between cognitive light cones and interoceptive signals. We're working on a paper about that, so I won't give spoilers, but yeah, there's super strong connections there.
Give us some little breadcrumbs and sneak peeks.
Basically, you build a cognitive light cone out of interoceptive signals, and that turns out to be a very powerful lens for doing economics in general. So just as I'm trying to put like these ideas based on economics to some degree, I'm also going to do a little bit of flip and also help to base economics on these kinds of ideas that we're talking about. So that should be fun.
Yeah, I'm definitely in support of this because I think that's kind of building off what I said before. I think it's the direction that a lot of things should move in, or at least it's a viable path by centering on the what makes the arena of choices, what makes the encapsulation of the world. A lot of like existing science and disciplines are okay, well here's the situation, and then the mechanistic, breaking down into parts, atomic structures, and that's great. But I think the work in like at a macro, I don't dance here, but like meta science, well, like where can field of study go? I think centering the relationship and the nature of the choice pressures and what makes the choice a choice and what is it relative to is a very exciting path to be on. I look forward to your writing it.
Yeah, I think the paper that's coming out should be very helpful for that. And as far as what makes a choice, I do think it comes back to just, so in economics, this is very clear, right? It's about selection over a set of alternatives. So if you have a bunch of things that are called options, I don't think you have to worry too hard about what makes something an option. I mean, I think you can think of all the options as things that are competing to be selected, basically. So just anything that fits the bill there. Then whatever process of selection occurs, the determinant of the outcome of that competition, that process is the choice. And I think that's going on internally. So I'd look up like Paul Chisek's affordance competition hypothesis, and there's other related work on motor behavior. We have competing motor plans and stuff. And you'll see that there are these internal processes of ordering and selection that we don't experience consciously, so we don't feel it as a choice, but there's economic choice clearly happening inside the body.
Yeah, when you say Chisek, is it the guy Cisek?
Yeah, I believe it's pronounced
Okay.
Chisek, but
okay, I thought I might have been hearing it wrong because like I know exactly who he is and I love his work.
He does great stuff. Yeah.
So yeah,
I heard Chisek once on a YouTube video. I'm like, okay, because I would have said Chisek, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I just so now like I can update all of my references from yesterday to this too. So that's cool. Absolutely to all that stuff. And I think even to kind of bring back to the intrigue of I think something that Addy had said before and others here, but like yes, exactly when it's alternatives, and then it's like the intriguing point for some of the things is when does something become an alternative or not? Like that space of like how do you start when you see sticks and stones and like, oh, that's great. And then they're like, oh wait, but I could make fire with this. Like I think that's sort of a very interesting. So just to return back to that part of it again too. But yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea about with things like fire and being able to see that in the sticks. I don't think that you can. I think it's a really good example of an emergent behavior. And almost by definition, emergent behaviors they're outside the theory. You're not going to be able to look at the pieces and then see that's there, which is why kind of experimental in science or free market and if economics is so important because you can't model those kinds of behaviors. You have to just kind of sample them after they're already occurring.
Yeah, and it's an interesting tie to our previous conversation yesterday about expertise and how if you have the expertise of knowing it, the ease of reproducing that thing, that emergent property or like way of using it, it's very affected and everything else. Sorry, there's a spontaneous music beside me, so I'm trying to get away from it. So more in a second.
Wait, is this the Bridgeside Cypher thing in Boston again?
The what now?
The Bridgeside Cypher thing in Boston. There was one yesterday. It was a freestyle rap session in the middle of the city or something.
No, this is it'd be cool if it was. This is a different music thing, but
I see. Got it.
Yes, shout out to Boston. everybody soon at the Oglab event.
Rep in
Very
Boston. Gotta pop up on August
Pop up.
23rd. Yeah, keep going though. Sorry. Just
That was all that I had about that. I'm sorry, I was all settled and now I had to run again. So whenever I get excited and walk, I always like overdo it. So I'll wait till it calms down to say more. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to know more about, in the case of Doctron, like how do these hyperorganisms perceive like information? Like if you had to really map it out, like what is their modality of perceiving information? One could say that they use these clusters of agency that maybe you call humans or language to enact the things that they're trying to do. So this is, I think this ties into when people would say, the universe is a mind and all these kinds of things. And I think if you would actually kind of take that seriously and run with it, you'd have to say, well, there's some sort of, again, it's the thoughts doing the thinker, the thought being the emergent property of the collective, the coordinated system that's instantiating itself through the parts. And there's something interesting that happens when you cluster and compress things together in a certain way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is I think one of the things that happens, like when you think about coordinating information from scattered sources, like, okay, the turkey sandwich, right? The turkey sandwich, in a sense, exists in a very, very scattered form, but it only has usefulness to ourselves as observers and systems if it's clustered together and concentrated in a certain way, right? I always say, like, a really good song, you can have a folder with all the drum sounds, all the key sounds, strings, everything, right? But the only way for you as an observer, at least in this state, to be able to make use of that is to not have it scattered so much. It's this ability to concentrate it, cluster its sense of pattern. It's this weird, I'm trying to find the right way to describe this, but I wonder if one of the things that happens, a very important property of these, let's say, larger scale systems, these hyperorganisms, whatever, that we may not even call them physical things as much as abstract organisms, is that they're using clusters of agency to embody different states.
Yeah,
right? Sort of like
absolutely.
an economy has all these different systems that are achieving the shared goal of a growing economical exchange system, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing they're tapping into is its sort of intelligence all the way down. I think all intelligence could be thought of as a form of collective intelligence. I think, in the sense, all computation can be thought of as an emergent property, because you get something that's happening that the parts aren't doing that. Wires aren't computers, neurons aren't brains, and people aren't markets, kind of thing. And so to see it like, so the thing that I call my word hyperorganism is something I just use to think about things that sort of have their own agency. They kind of operate in the world as if they were organisms, but they're not necessarily embodied. They can kind of be non-corporeal, and that they're operating at one layer up from people, and that they're made out of people, but they're not people. So everything from a soccer team to a family unit to a multinational corporation, things where if you trade out any of the parts, it would still kind of operate. But these things have intelligence. They're very capable. And if you think about like sort of the large companies on the planet, they are more powerful than any humans or any small collection of humans. And the only thing that compete at those levels are other kind of hyperorganisms. And then there's like different flavors. There's things that are part of the military industrial complex, and then there's things that are part of kind of cultural phenomenon. You could put religions in there. You could put art and media and all kinds of things where you have these systems where we can't stop them. I think is another way to think about it, that they're operating in a layer up. When I hear conversation about like, can we control AI? To me, I respond like, well, can you control Bitcoin? Can you control soccer? Even things like that, where, can you control what pop music sounds like? No, these are like global things. And unless you somehow controlled the whole planet, which would break that system to begin with. And so they really are kind of operating at a different level. And as individuals, as humans, we don't really have the language to think about or even to recognize their existence. And that we have to remember that when we think about, like, do these corporations care about humans? Well, caring about other humans is something humans do. These are kind of cybernetic feedback loops. They're like organisms, but they're operating at a different scale. And so it's not just that they don't care about people, it's that sometimes they can't care about people. They don't have mechanisms to do that. And I think that that distinction is something that we need to develop so that we can be aware of how these hyperorganisms are essentially in control of the planet and our species.
Yeah, that's a huge topic, and that's obviously super relevant today with the whole AI thing and how do you get AIs to like us? And we don't really know how to do that, but they're getting smarter and smarter. So we'll see if we're able to figure that out in time.
I mean,
Yeah, I
it's
think
like, yeah, it's like asking, you know, can you get alligators to care about humans? No, probably not. They're not equipped.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a certified Florida man, I can agree with this. I could say the alligators are probably not yeah. I don't think I don't know if they have that sort of capability, but it's interesting though. So this is maybe a fun way to Florida man represent. Yes. And this goes through sort of everyone, you know, in the audience as well. And so there's this other thought experiment that I've talked about multiple times on the Salon, and it's getting at one of the core ideas of in the nature of what coordination language, you could say this pricing system is here's a sort of a thought experiment, right? Let's say you have two people. Now, let's say they each have, say, an IQ of about 100 each, right? Just independently, the 100, person A, person B. Now, again, I have my own critiques on the way we measure these abstract properties of intelligence and IQ, but for sake of the argument, let's run with this because I think that actually makes it more fun. Now, let's just say you have a question, a problem that is much more advanced than those two people. So let's just say if they each have an IQ of 100, the question is something only a 200 IQ person could solve, for instance. In what way could those two people coordinate their minds, the process of abstraction, right, within an you know, efficient slice of space and time? You know, it's one thing if you want to stretch this out for a year, then maybe they'll probably figure it out anyways. But is there a way you can take people who are sort of, again, separate parts, 100 and 100, and is there a way that you can coordinate their minds where they can actually synergize and add their IQs together to solve something that would be like a 200 IQ kind of problem? And again, I think we already have things that do this in really good teams and really good ways of binding, you know, these cognitive binding systems that we call trust and language and all that. I think good teams that are able to grow very quickly, work through solid delegation where you don't have to keep asking the other node in the network for permission if this is right or wrong. But I think this becomes a little more interesting when you think of very abstracted problems, right? If it's a tangible thing, it's a little easier to coordinate. But if it's this very, very abstract and ambiguous thing, how do you coordinate the mind? And I think that the way that you would accomplish this, in my mode of thinking, is, okay, you need some kind of a different kind of language that allows you to coordinate the mind like that allows you to bind those things. Because you don't just squish and connect and integrate two minds together, right? Like I said the other day, if you want a V12 engine, you don't just crush two V6 engines together. Sure, they're at a molecular level, sure, they're kind of getting mixed up, fine. But from a higher level functional standpoint, you have to rearrange both the two engines to kind of get it to function a certain way, right, Dugan? We talked about this the other day.
Mm-hmm.
This is the same thing where we say you have two PCs. You don't just mash the PCs together until you've combined them like mixing two pieces of Play-Doh. You have to functionally, geometrically reintegrate both systems. And I think that's one of the things that language does. And to Benjamin's work, I think that's something that the nature of a currency will also do, is the nature of the currency that you're sharing in this pricing system. I'm curious if you've thought about this idea.
Yeah, where I tend to go with that is just to think about those bow ties. How would you take two people who aren't touching each other, who have to coordinate very efficiently, so without much interaction or anything? I mean, I think basically that's what bow tie architectures help us do, where you can take any one guy's history, he creates some code, you know, some symbol, whatever, and then any other guy's history, he's able to take that and do whatever he wants with it. They still need to have some interaction, of course. So like I think we talked about this yesterday, the example of like people on a basketball court creating the marginal conditions of like determining where they're going to go on a basketball court, depending on the marginal value of the next shot. And so I think through that kind of interaction, you're able to create these kinds of things. And it does kind of come down to maybe like what are the simplest conditions under which you can create a useful bow tie architecture. for allowing people to coordinate without really having to interact with each other too much. It's kind of what happens in the price system. We're able to make all these purchasing decisions without having to talk to other shoppers and be like, hey, everyone, I'm buying some oatmeal, so nobody else buy oatmeal. We don't really have to talk to each other, but just the bow tie prices help us figure it out.
Interesting. And I think Eli has a comment, if you want to mention that, by the way.
I have some background noise, but maybe Google Meet's fine here.
That's good.
Yeah, for the chip analogy, it was just a kind of interesting note that like we have literally gotten to the point where it is just put two of the exact one together, as long as the whole entire thing, like from the get-go or from the very base like principles, has been optimized for. I don't even know how they do it, but the M3 Ultra is literally just two M3 Maxes and glue. So, and it scales linearly, which is very interesting.
I guess then the next thing to talk about, tying into the nature of the hyperorganism computational irreducibility, and then Benjamin Lyons, this what's the best way to call your theory, Benjamin? How would you want us to talk about it?
Economics of collective intelligence, I guess.
Economics of collective intelligence. All right, so something, when I think of the economics of collective intelligence, hyperorganisms, computational irreducibility, and even Dugan, what you and Benjamin were talking about yesterday when we were saying the economics of geometry and the reason why contained spaces are shaped a certain way to fit some kind of function or metric, is when I think of all these things, it's also saying, again, it's coordination in space and in time, and across distance. And there's something that happens when you get, the system that you're trying to coordinate when they're further apart in space and they're further apart in time, right? It's easy to see how things could connect, if they're very close to each other, right? But now it's when they're far apart. And now this also goes into the turkey sandwich thing and the music example that I was saying earlier, is what type of coordination system, what kind of binding system, whatever, is able to let you stitch together spatial continuity and temporal continuity. And it's not just stitching it together, right? Because there's a way that you stitch it together where, for instance, the musical instrument thing, right? Or the song, is I can take all the parts to that song, but if I arrange it differently in time, it's going to have a very different output or value, right, to the observer. It can mean very different things to different observers. One person may find it enjoyable. They'll let it into their mind and really enjoy it, and the other person is going to toss it out.
You've seen the meme that floats around for Linus Torvalds' birthday, and they'll have a picture of flour, eggs, butter, and sugar, and they say, "Here's your cake. Compile it yourself."
That's really well put. That just demonstrated the point beautifully, actually. Wow. That's interesting. Yeah. And I guess what you're doing when you're programming is you're coordinating possible states in time into a single running system in a way. Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, the economy does a lot of, the coordinating through space and time. I mean, that is, again, basically a thing that just goes back to Adam Smith. And the price system is so easy for humans to use because you do need some kind of common understanding of like, what is a number, right? Like you need to be able to read, $5 and understand what $5 means. But as long as you have that and like electronic technology for updating prices very quickly and transmitting them across the globe very quickly, you're able to achieve just a tremendous amount of coordination, like all of us are, perhaps without realizing it, coordinating with people who are hundreds or thousands of miles away from us, who help to produce the goods and services that we enjoy. And those production processes, they take a long time. We're paying for things that were done in the past. We're paying for things that will be done in the future. And so, yeah, that's the price system has that power. Basically, you just need the technology to transmit the prices quickly through space and time. You need to have enough general understanding among the agents in the system so that everyone can understand what a dollar means. But that's a very low level of common understanding because it's very easy to understand that.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about high frequency trading because what that service is doing is sort of providing real-time information about the total aggregation of like the world economy, such that if something happens over here, you want to update the price for it, and so you have like this very cutthroat competition of making sure that those prices are accurate.
Yeah, for sure. Speed's a huge deal. Imagine if your brain only found out about something that happened to your kidneys after like 20 seconds. It's like, that's too slow. You got to speed that up. So yeah, speed's a big deal.
But for some
Mhm.
things, it does work that way. For things like appetite and so on,
Mhm.
there are these kind of delays of on the order of 20 minutes. And these
Mhm.
are hard for us to understand.
Yeah. And that's why people like overeats. Like there are huge issues with that. I mean, like honestly, it's a funny idea, but if you could somehow like get some high frequency trading cells in the gut maybe and like update the brain, maybe you can solve the obesity crisis with that.
Exactly.
So one of the things that I was thinking about is how, the question about coordination across distance in space and in time, and sort of the high frequency trading thing and how that ties into that, right? Is even when we were talking about yesterday about the sort of time dilation thing, is in a sense, you already kind of experienced that if you're sending a message from place A to place B and you're really far, even just on the Earth, right? If that's the only measure of something that's happening to you, you don't actually have that universal sense of time, right? So I'm person A, I want to get a message to person B by pigeon or whatever. There is going to be a delay in that process in the same way that you move it at larger scales and say, a more astronomical system, right? Is you have this dilation effect, but I think you see the dilation effect in just different ways across scales, right? If you don't have this universal timekeeping system like we have these days in a well-connected world, like let's just say a really dense city or a state that's very technologically interconnected, you go from all the way up north, drive down a couple hours, and the situation could have changed. The message that you're carrying with respect to time was only sourced from that point that you were in, and you bring it over to the next person, and that may not even be relevant anymore. So there's something about the clustering, remember what I was saying about the clustering and compression, about bringing coordination closer to the other systems. Or an aspect of coordination is bringing things closer together in this coherent way, that you're able to get less of a delay in feedback and this sort of sender-receiver relationship. And now I guess this brings up the idea about, is there a thing about scale that the smaller you go, you go from these larger systems, but then you go to a cellular, chemical, physics level of things, that it's able to let you work quicker, right? There's because things have these properties of the scale that you're working in, they're allowing you to communicate between systems quicker, right? And also, could that potentially explain? Does that explain the limits in intelligence and say AI or biological systems, right? Because Stephen Wolf for Dugan, right, has the thing about bigger brains, and what I wonder if it's actually possible to have a more intelligent system with a smaller brain.
You go faster. The transit time is less.
Yeah.
Well, that's why the brain's folded over, right? Like,
Right.
just cram it up in there and get more points of contact in a smaller space.
It's like in Dune, you fold space rather than going through it.
Right.
Right. Or you have these myelin sheaths that kind of allow for faster.
And I think
Those
this
are
is
like
what,
wormholes.
yeah. I think this is what was kind of a retake on, I think, a point raised by many people, potentially Addy earlier, about shape. Like it kind of goes back to shape and geometrics and what qualities, what does the shape or structure itself afford? This kind of goes all the way back to like Zeta and the genomic bottleneck and sort of, it's a developmental capacity of all these things. So I think it's worth, are you Addy, were you trying to get in a sense of like trying to make a smaller sort of like not quite Feynman's a lot of room at the bottom, but like were you trying to look at it from the sense of reducing the space or like ways to minimize the ways to sort of facilitate perceived or real like distance or
Yeah, this is once again, I guess, an economic thing for Benjamin as well. But when if I'm trying to make the system smaller, it's usually because I'm seeking this thing that I call efficiency. And shrinking a system or reshaping in a certain way in space lets you get more out of time, if you make an engine more efficient, you can literally actually
Absolutely.
reduce some of the parts, connect the parts differently, and you can actually get it to do more in time than it would if it wasn't organized that way. And I'm just thinking
Yes.
from that perspective, I'm trying to understand what's so special about the shape of the brain. Why is the brain not shaped like other organs in the body? Why does it have the geometrical properties that it does? Because then again, it goes to that thing Dugan and Benjamin were talking about yesterday about the economics of geometry, right? There's a reason when you have this criteria of the space that you're working in, how many ways can you pack in these properties, right? It's
Yes.
yeah. And then Benjamin, you brought up the bubble thing with Michael Levin too, as well, right?
I think that's a very interesting lens that I would like to almost like tag. I want to tag this in the recording and say, let's talk about this specifically ahead. And then we have, but like getting more out of time, as in the sense of as in I kind of see it like you're saying, the passage of time is a finite medium, if you will, or a space, and how using that space to have efficiency or to put as much signal into it. And it kind of comes into, I think, like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 salons ago. I remember this comment. I wish I could remember it as in high fidelity as I want to, but essentially, because you've said things like how what are the things that every individual agent would need to get to a place where they could interpret this new thing. And I think it's sort of the other side of that same coin, in the sense of, to have the compression or this refined, almost like when you're compressing like the zip file, when you're reducing everything to this compressed state with a lot of signal for those that know how to interpret it, and then it's just, yeah, for those that know how to interpret it when it's decompressed or when it's extracted out. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you have something that's non-compressed, then they'll have like a lot of repeated elements that are, it doesn't look like static,
Mhm.
essentially. And then you compress it, and that compressed form should look as much like static or random noise as possible. It just has embedded within that the mechanisms to reinterpret it and expand it itself back out.
Mhm.
Real quick, Dr. On has to leave. I think he's got somewhere to go, but we'll let him say goodbye, and then we'll finish up in about half an hour, 20 minutes.
Yeah, I just want to say fantastic conversation. Really look forward to continuing this again. I think you're onto some really amazing stuff. Would love to hear more. It reminded me just one thing I wanted to leave with you were saying earlier, Addy, can we combine minds to get something better? And I think that's what we do. I think that's what humans are. I think that's the kind of the nature of collective intelligence, that everything from, running an economy to even just running a small village, it's outside the capabilities of a single human mind. And so we all have to work together. And it reminds me of an idea I really like. It's actually a branch of cybernetics called conversation theory, in that knowledge is actually created through conversations. So I just want to thank everybody today for this amazing conversation, and look forward to talking to you guys again soon.
Absolutely. Great to meet you. Really appreciate it.
Awesome.
Likewise.
Take care.
Bye, Will.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Addy.
It's
Thanks,
nice
Dugan.
talking.
Thanks, Eli, Jesse. Talk to everybody soon.
Take care.
Take care.
Yeah. Excuse me.
See you, man. On the nature of what he said about these things are created from conversation, wouldn't you also say that conversation is basically a form of exchanging, Benjamin?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
although it's interesting in what sense. So normally we think of exchange as a very concrete thing, like my apple for your orange. When we're talking more abstractly about ideas, like I have very little ability to actually like put my thoughts into your mind or vice versa. So it is in some ways more comparable to creating these kinds of abstract bow ties where I try to say some stuff and hope that you interpret it in a way that's conducive to what I'm trying to achieve in this conversation. But ultimately, you're going to interpret it in a way that makes sense to you based on your history and your goals. So we're never going to have the typical kind of concrete exchange that we consider in just sort of a simple economic case.
Yeah, it actually, so I had a conversation. This is actually someone from Augmentation Lab who you'll probably end up getting to have a conversation with when you come for it. By the way, you're on the page for it. We put you up.
Cool.
And Dugan. We got you guys confirmed on there. Jesse, we're waiting to put yours up. Yeah. And
right.
So we had a conversation about like red or something like that, right? The qualia, the perception of red, or could be any color, but red in this case. And I was saying something along the lines of, it's not necessarily, this is the isomorphism square thing that you were saying yesterday. It's not necessarily that your red is my red, but that the relation between your red and all the other colors in the color wheel, the sort of distribution, have the same relations that I do. So that through this relational framework, we're able to understand things, right? And so, yeah, like I can still communicate your red to you as long as my red has this relationship with all the other colors that I'm working with, right? And we probably don't see the identical shade of red, right? We probably don't. And now the question is what are the benefits to having these systems that are not coordinated at baseline? Right, what is it about the process? I feel like this is something Ian McGilchrist said at one point about the process of learning and abstracting that's able to give you some pretty interesting, let's say, powers and properties in terms of cognitive capability, right? Is because, one of the things that happens is that if something is already given at baseline, sometimes you don't even realize that you're using it. You have to sort of have it taken away from you. This is, again, a relational thing about you only kind of know what you have by what you don't. And then you're able to get a better understanding of it and maybe even try to control it and grow it in a different way. Curious if this brings up any ideas, Benjamin and Dugan.
It is the case that the economy is able to achieve a high level of coordination with a very low level of commonality among the parts. Most interactions are handled outside of the price system currently, and so we do rely on other things like culture and language and so on. But in principle, you can have what economists call a system of complete markets, where all interactions are just governed by the price system. And the amount of commonality you need there is incredibly low. And so it could be the case that isn't even happening with first-person experiences. No idea how to verify that, but it's certainly a possibility.
Interesting. Can you leave us with a couple other ideas or thoughts to marinate on for a part 2 and then also for your augmentation lab exhibit, Benjamin?
I'm a big fan of just like research and evidence and just doing a little bit of, sort of pavement pounding, so to speak. I'd strongly encourage anyone who's interested in this stuff to look at the research of Lisa Feldman Barrett, to also look at the work of Esther Thalin. Both of those things are hugely influential to me. They also tremendously overlap with the ideas of Michael Levin, which I know are very popular, spreading a lot right now. If you're interested in Michael Levin type stuff, you should check out Lisa Feldman Barrett and Esther Thalin. You're going to find a lot of overlap and a lot of additional support and evidence and ways of thinking about these ideas.
Have you already had a conversation with Lisa?
I interned at her lab for a month a long time ago. We had exactly one very brief interaction. I haven't spoken to her since, but I read all her papers. I think she's great. You should get in touch with some other people from her lab. I'll send you an email. You should talk to Jordan Theriot and Eli Senish. They're doing great stuff, and they can really help you come to grips with her ideas and where things are going in 2025 and beyond.
Jesse, you were saying something.
I'm deeply appreciative of Benjamin being here, and I look forward to. He's gonna be at the summit, which would be great, because this is when I was doing this is basically a direction where I made a group a while ago called Connection Futures, and it's basically been on hiatus for a year because I finished grad school and kind of shifting some things I've been doing. But this is exactly where I wanted to go with it, because I saw these things a while ago, like the overlap between Levin and Lisa Feldman Barrett, and what Lisa's doing with construction of motion, allostasis, and the economic stuff is super. I really do think that this is one of like, to zoom out, like I've really been interested for a long time. How do we do science knowledge development differently? How do we bridge some of the gaps? I really truly think this is one of the things I would flag as like this space and what it can do for bring forward certain things is really good. So I'm super glad to have heard that from Benjamin, who's like been way more deeper in the weeds there to bring it out. So just thumbs up to that.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad other people are seeing the connections as well. That way I know I'm not crazy. I'll post a link here. This is a big sort of summary essay of some of the big main similarities between Lisa's work, Esther Thalen's work and Mike's work. So anyone who's interested in those ideas should check that essay out. It's a big, nice overview with some links to some cool research.
Yes. Handshake meme to that. All right.
There you go.
Yeah. And Benjamin, maybe if you're interested, we can find a way for a Polymath Salon, either in person or online, to have a conversation between you and Lisa.
Lisa's very hard to get in touch with. She's got a very crammed inbox, but if you can get a hold of her, that would be great. I think more realistic is probably to get in touch with Jordan and Eli. So I'll send you their deets. They're doing cool stuff. I think Lisa's also trying to pare back some of what she's doing, and Jordan and Eli and some of the young folk are now like the new wave, I think, is my impression.
Got it.
Yeah. I think Benjamin is much more connected than I am, but I have like a light connection to a few of those folks too. So maybe we can all pull on them benevolently together and
coordinate our connections together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Do you get any lasting thoughts before we head
Very
out?
interesting stuff. Thank you so much.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's great
All
to meet you. This has been fantastic.
So I know at least the three of you here are all going to see each other at the summit, right?
Yes.
yeah.
Wonderful. Awesome. I'm extremely hyped and excited. Please share this on your social media, your group chats, all that kind of stuff. We are looking for more like-minded exhibitors. They can be researchers, engineers, builders, even artists, or people who blur the lines between all those, like Dugan. But yeah, this is a pleasure as always. I know Scott came in a little late. We'll have the recording up for you to see Scott. But pleasure as always. And real quick, Benjamin, where can people find you?
I have a website, benjaminflyons.com, but you can read my work at interestingessays.substack.com because I'm great with names. I have a Twitter handle, but it's got a bunch of numbers and I don't remember it. I should remember it. Send me an email at benjamin.f.lyons.com. I'm good with email. benjamin.f.lyons@gmail.com.
Perfect. Awesome. I'll see some of you guys for the next Polymath Salon online, and then also for the Augmentation Lab Summit at MIT.
Sounds good. Hey, thanks so much for inviting me to do this. This was great. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's been fantastic to meet all of you because that's something I need to do, and so it's great to do that.
There you go. I'll connect you with other people. We'll talk.
Awesome. Thank you.
Awesome, Benjamin. All right. See you guys. Bye.
Take care, everybody.